My name is Steve. I lost my career, my house, and my professional reputation because I refused to sign off on a death trap. So I waited until my boss invested every cent he had into his dream project before I turned his entire empire into a pile of illegal rubble. My name is Steve, and I spent 15 years becoming one of the most respected structural engineers in the city. But all that hard work meant nothing the moment I crossed a man named Robert. Robert was the kind of person who didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be feared. He owned a massive development company and had a reputation for finishing projects ahead of schedule and under budget. For a long time, people thought he was a genius. But I eventually learned that his secret to success was a mixture of intimidation and total disregard for human life. Robert was the definition of entitled. He drove a custom sports car that he would park across 2 handicap spots, right in front of the office every single morning. If a secretary didn't have his specific brand of mineral water waiting on his desk at exactly room temperature, he would scream at her until she cried, then dock her pay for wasting his time. He viewed everyone around him as tools to be used and discarded. He once told me during a private lunch that laws and safety codes were just suggestions for people who weren't smart enough to work around them. I should have quit right then, but I had a mortgage and a family to support. The real trouble started when Robert took on his biggest project yet, a massive luxury high-rise apartment complex in the heart of the downtown area. He called it the Crown Plaza. This was supposed to be his legacy. He poured hundreds of millions of dollars into it, and he was already selling penthouse suites for $5 million apiece before the foundation was even finished. I was the lead engineer on the project, and my job was to sign off on the structural integrity of the main support columns. About halfway through the build, I noticed something terrifying. Robert had switched the specified high-grade reinforced steel for a cheaper, lower-quality alloy from a supplier he personally owned. Even worse, the concrete mix being used was not cured correctly because he was forcing the crews to work through heavy rain to meet a marketing deadline. I ran the simulations on my computer, and the results made my blood run cold. If the building reached full capacity, the vibrations from the nearby subway line combined with the weight of the residents would cause the lower support columns to shear. The building wouldn't just lean, it would pancake. I went to Robert's office with the data, thinking he would be horrified. Instead, he didn't even look up from his phone. He told me to sit down and shut up. When I showed him the report, he laughed. He told me that I was being a nervous old man and that the building only needed to stand long enough for him to sell the units and exit the LLC. I told him I wouldn't sign the safety certification. Robert stood up, walked over to me, and got so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He told me that if I didn't sign that paper by the end of the day, he would make sure I never worked as an engineer again. He said he owned the licensing board, he owned the local media, and he owned me. He actually poked me in the chest with his finger and said that he was the king of this city and I was just a bug under his shoe. I refused again, and within an hour, security was escorting me out of the building. But Robert wasn't done with me. Over the next month, a series of coordinated lies began to circulate. Robert used his connections to file a formal complaint against my license, claiming I had been taking bribes from contractors to overlook safety flaws. He even fabricated bank statements and emails that made it look like I was the corrupt one. Because he had so much influence, the local news picked up the story. I was blacklisted. My firm fired me. My professional insurance was canceled. And I was forced to sell my house just to pay for the legal fees to fight the false charges. I lost everything while Robert stood on television cutting the ribbon for the grand opening of his new mansion, which he built right next to the construction site of the high-rise. He looked into the camera and called me a disgrace to the profession. He thought he had crushed me. He thought that by taking my money and my title, he had taken my power. What he forgot was that I still had my brain and I knew every single inch of the land he was building on. I spent those dark months living in a tiny studio apartment fueled by nothing but coffee in a burning need for justice. I started digging into the geological surveys that Robert had suppressed years ago. I spent my days at the city records office posing as a student researcher looking at old maps from the 1920s. That is when I found it. Robert had made a fatal mistake in his arrogance. He assumed that because he could buy people, he could also buy nature. He had built his entire empire on a lie, and I was the only person who knew exactly which string to pull to make the whole thing unravel. I wasn't just going to clear my name. I was going to make sure Robert felt the weight of every single ton of concrete he had cheated on. The war was just beginning, and Robert had no idea that the bug he tried to crush was about to bring his entire kingdom down. After I was fired and my reputation was dragged through the mud, I actually tried to make things right the professional way. I thought that if I presented the facts to the city council and the building inspectors, logic would prevail. I spent my last bit of savings hiring a private lab to test a sample of the concrete I had managed to take from the site before I was kicked out. I wrote a 40-page report detailing the exact structural risks of the Crown Plaza and sent it to every city official I could find. I wasn't even asking for my job back at that point. I just wanted to make sure the people moving into those apartments wouldn't be crushed in their sleep. But Robert's reach was even deeper than I feared. A week after I sent those reports, I was walking to my car after a grocery trip when a black sedan pulled up beside me. Robert rolled down the window wearing a $1,000 suit and a smirk that made my skin crawl. He didn't say a word at first. He just tossed a thick envelope out of the window onto the wet pavement. Inside was my report, torn into pieces and covered in what looked like coffee stains. Robert told me that the head of the building department was a golf buddy of his and had personally handed me my files to laugh over. He told me that every time I opened my mouth, he would add another year to the lawsuit he was filing against me for defamation. He said he enjoyed watching me struggle and that he was going to make sure I ended up under a bridge. He then revved his engine, splashing muddy water all over my clothes, and drove off laughing. I tried to stay calm, but the harassment didn't stop at just blocking my reports. A few weeks later, I was at a small local cafe trying to use their free internet to look for work since I could no longer afford my home connection. Robert walked in with 3 of his top executives. The place was nearly empty, but he made a point of walking over to my table. He didn't ask to sit, he just stood over me, casting a shadow across my laptop screen. He told his friends loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear that I was a failed engineer who tried to shake him down for $1 million to keep quiet about fake safety issues. He called me a bottom feeder and a parasite. When I tried to stand up to leave, he put a hand on my shoulder and pushed me back down into the chair. He leaned in and whispered that he had contacted the owner of the small consulting firm I had just applied to for a low-level drafting job. He told me he had convinced them that hiring me would be a liability nightmare. By the time I got home that afternoon, I had an email from that firm telling me the position had been filled. Robert was actively hunting me, making sure that even the smallest spark of hope was extinguished before it could grow. The third incident was the one that finally broke my spirit and turned my desire for peace into a desire for total destruction. I had a few personal items left in my old office, including a framed photo of my father, who had been a builder himself. It was the only thing I really cared about. I sent a polite, formal request to the Human Resources Department to have my personal effects mailed to my apartment. Instead of a package, I received a video message on my phone from an unknown number. The video showed Robert in the middle of the Crown Plaza construction site. He was standing next to a large industrial trash incinerator. He held my father's photo up to the camera and smiled. He said that since I was so worried about things being up to code, he was doing a site-wide cleanup of all the garbage. He dropped the frame into the fire and watched it burn while he told the camera that I was officially erased from the history of this city. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I had tried to be the bigger person. I had tried to use the legal system, the city government, and professional ethics to solve the problem. Robert had responded by burning my memories, blocking my income, and gloating about his power over the law. I realized then that as long as I played by the rules, I would lose because Robert owned the people who wrote the rules. He felt untouchable because he had money and friends in high places. He thought the game was over because he had taken my queen and both my rooks, but he didn't realize I was playing a completely different game on a different board. I stopped responding to his taunts. I stopped sending reports to the city. I even stopped answering the calls from the debt collectors. I disappeared into the basement of the city library, spending 12 hours a day studying the one thing Robert couldn't bribe or intimidate: the earth itself. I found that the massive mansion Robert was building for himself was being marketed as an eco-friendly masterpiece, but the geological data showed it sat directly over a subterranean limestone cavern system that fed the city's primary backup water reserve. Robert had bribed a surveyor to list the ground as solid bedrock. In his rush to build his palace and his high-rise, he had ignored the fact that he was essentially building on a giant hollow eggshell. I also discovered that the city had passed a very specific, very strict Environmental Protection Act 30 years ago that had been forgotten by almost everyone. It stated that any construction found to be contaminating an active aquifer was subject to immediate, non-negotiable demolition at the owner's expense, with no possibility of an appeal if the damage was deemed a public health crisis. Robert thought he was a king, but he had built his throne on a foundation of sand and secrets, and I was about to become the tide. I spent the next 4 months working as a delivery driver at night to pay for the specialized soil sensors I needed. I would sneak onto the perimeter of his property at 3 o'clock in the morning, disguised as a construction worker to plant the devices. I wasn't just looking for flaws anymore. I was gathering the kind of evidence that a golf buddy at the building department couldn't ignore. I was preparing a trap so large and so absolute that it wouldn't just cost him his project, it would cost him his entire life's work. Robert wanted to play dirty, and I was finally ready to show him exactly how much filth I could find under his feet. The breaking point didn't come when Robert burned my father's photo, but when he got me blacklisted from every firm in the state. It came on a Tuesday evening when I returned to my tiny studio apartment to find the door kicked in and my life turned upside down. Robert hadn't just sent a message this time. He had sent a crew. My laptop, which contained all my research, was smashed into pieces on the floor. My furniture was shredded, and my clothes were tossed into the bathtub and soaked in bleach. But the worst part was the small wooden box I kept on my nightstand. It contained the original hand-drawn blueprints of the first bridge my father had ever built. They were priceless to me. And Robert's thugs had spray-painted a giant red circle with a line through it over the delicate ink drawings. They left a note pinned to the wall with a kitchen knife that simply said, "Move out of the state where the next thing we break will be your legs." I sat on the floor of my ruined home for 3 hours in total silence. I didn't cry and I didn't call the police. I knew the police wouldn't do anything because the sergeant in this precinct was probably on Robert's payroll just like everyone else. I realized in that moment that I had been far too kind. I had been trying to stop a building from falling, but I should have been focused on making sure Robert fell with it. My peaceful methods were a joke to a man like him. He viewed my ethics as a weakness and my adherence to the law as a leash that he could pull whenever he wanted. That night, I decided to cut the leash. I realized that if I couldn't work as an engineer, I would work as a ghost. I spent the last of my emergency cash on a high-end waterproof camera and a specialized set of industrial testing tools that I bought under a fake name from an out-of-state supplier. My target was no longer just the apartment complex. I was going after Robert's soul, which was his bank account and his precious reputation. Robert was preparing for the grand unveiling of his personal mansion, which he had named the Emerald Estate. It was a sprawling 50,000 square FT monstrosity that he had built right on the edge of the city's protected wetlands. He was planning a massive gala to celebrate both the completion of his mansion and the topping out of the Crown Plaza high-rise. He had invited the governor, the mayor, and every major investor in the region. He wanted to show the world that he was the master of the skyline. What he didn't know was that while he was busy picking out tuxedos in imported marble, I was spending every night in the mud. I discovered that to save money on the Emerald Estate, Robert had instructed his contractors to bypass the city's sewage system entirely. He had installed a massive illegal septic field that was hidden under a decorative lake in his front yard. This wasn't just a building code violation. It was a federal environmental crime because that lake sat directly above the primary recharge zone for the local aquifer. Even worse, I found the smoking gun I'd been looking for in the drainage pipes. Robert had been using the construction side of the high-rise to dump toxic chemical runoff from his other industrial projects. He was literally pouring heavy metals and industrial solvents into the ground to avoid the cost of hazardous waste disposal. He thought the earth would just swallow his secrets. I spent 3 weeks documented every single pipe and every single gallon of poison. I took hundreds of high-resolution photos and gathered soil samples that were so toxic they glowed under a UV light. I didn't send them to the city building department this time. I knew they would just disappear into a shredder. Instead, I sent them to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and the state's Attorney General under a Whistleblower Protection Act that Robert's local friends couldn't touch. I also made sure to send copies to the insurance companies that were backing his $100 million loans. But I wasn't done. The real sting was going to happen at his gala. Robert had a giant digital screen set up on the side of his mansion to show a time-lapse video of the construction to all his wealthy guests. I spent the week before the event using my old access codes, which he had been too arrogant to change, to hack into his private server. I replaced his polished marketing video with a very different kind of presentation. I included the footage of the faulty concrete at the high-rise, the images of the illegal toxic waste dumping, and the geological scans showing that his mansion was sitting on a limestone shelf that was already starting to crack under the weight of his ego. I also found his private ledger where he recorded the bribes he paid to the local inspectors. I scanned every page and formatted it to play in a slow crawl across the screen like movie credits. I was no longer an engineer. I was a demolition expert, and I was going to pull the trigger when the maximum amount of people were watching. I watched from the woods with a pair of binoculars on the night of the gala. I saw the line of limousines and the men in expensive suits. I saw Robert standing on his balcony holding a glass of champagne, looking out over the city like he owned it. He looked so confident and so untouchable. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was literally and figuratively about to open up. I felt a cold clarity that I had never felt before. He had destroyed my home, my career, and my father's legacy because he thought he was above the consequences of his actions. He was about to learn that when you build a house of cards, you shouldn't do it in a windstorm. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I had a single button to press that would upload the final sequence to his server and trigger the alerts to the federal authorities. I looked at the red circle on my father's bridge plans one last time and I pressed it. The countdown had started, and there was absolutely nothing Robert could do to stop the collapse. I knew that simply exposing Robert was not enough, because men like him have a way of sliding out of trouble when the spotlight fades. I needed a total systemic collapse of his entire world. My plan was divided into 3 distinct phases that I called the foundation, the fracture, and the failure. For the first phase, I spent months building a digital ghost profile to infiltrate his company's procurement system. Since Robert was obsessed with cutting costs, he had centralized all his purchasing through a single encrypted portal. I used my knowledge of the company's internal server architecture to create a series of dummy subcontractors. I didn't steal money, but I redirected the orders for the high-rise construction. I made sure that every single shipment of steel and concrete for the final stages of the project was documented with a dual set of records. One set showed the fake high-quality materials Robert thought he was buying to fool the banks, while the other set, which was hidden in a cloud drive only I could access, showed the actual substandard trash he was actually using. I essentially acted as a secret auditor for his own crimes. I spent my nights in the mud around the Emerald Estate, taking core samples of the earth, using a manual hand auger to avoid making noise. I mapped the exact locations where his illegal septic lines were leaking into the limestone. I realized that the cavern system below his mansion was even more fragile than the initial survey suggested. I found that his massive infinity pool, which held over 50,000 gallons of water, was positioned directly over a major structural fault in the rock. If that rock was even slightly destabilized, the entire pool and the west wing of the mansion would drop 30 FT into an underground void. For the second phase, I focused on the money. I knew that Robert had taken out massive high-interest construction loans that were contingent on him passing a series of independent safety inspections by the end of the fiscal year. These inspectors were supposed to be third-party, but I knew they were just his friends. I waited until the week before the inspection and sent a series of anonymous packages to the Federal Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. These packages didn't contain my complaints. They contained the names and personal bank account details of the inspectors Robert was bribing. I didn't give them the evidence of the building flaws yet. I gave them the evidence of the financial fraud. This ensured that the federal government would flag his accounts and freeze his assets for a manual audit right at the moment he needed the most liquidity to finish the project. The third phase was the actual trap, which was set for the night of his grand gala. I had spent weeks studying the mansion's automated smart home system. Robert had integrated everything into one central hub, from the lighting and the security to the heavy-duty pumps, that managed his illegal lake in the infinity pool. I found a massive vulnerability in the firmware of the pump controllers. I wrote a simple script that would override the safety sensors on the pool's drainage system. Instead of maintaining the water level, the script would force the pumps to rapidly cycle the water out of the pool and into the illegal septic field below the house. This would effectively saturate the already weak limestone foundation with 50,000 gallons of water in less than an hour, creating a localized sinkhole. On the night of the event, I didn't just show up to watch. I arrived 3 hours early, dressed as a catering server. I planted a small wireless bridge in the server room that gave me full control over the house's exterior displays and the public address system. I sat in a rental van a half-mile away with 3 monitors glowing in the dark. I watched the live feed as the governor and the billionaire investors arrived in their tuxedos. I saw Robert, standing in the center of the ballroom, bragging about how he had built a monument that would last 100 years. I waited until the moment he stepped onto the stage to give his keynote speech. I saw him tap the microphone and smile at the crowd of 500 people. That was when I initiated the script. First, the giant digital screens outside stopped showing the time lapse of the construction. and began flashing the internal bank ledgers that proved he had been embezzling from his own investors. Then the public address system began playing a looped recording of the conversation Robert had with me, where he admitted he didn't care if the building collapsed as long as he got his money. The room went dead silent as his own voice filled the mansion. But the final blow was physical. I triggered the pool pumps. On my thermal camera, I could see the water being forced into the ground at a terrifying rate.